You? Yes, you. The gurney in Bay 4 needs to go up to imaging and my patient has been waiting 9 minutes. Do your job or I'll find someone who wants theirs. Dr. Elijah Cross was standing in the corridor of Elstrom Memorial in his surgical scrubs, a tablet of neurological imaging in his hand 30 seconds out of a 6-hour operation that had saved a man's ability to speak. The man barking at him was Gordon Reeve, chief of neurosurgery Silver at the Temples, immaculate, the most powerful surgeon in the building. Reeve had looked at Elijah, seen the scrubs in the face, and decided with the total confidence of a man who had never once been wrong in a way that cost him anything that he was looking at transport staff. "I'm not transport," Elijah said evenly. "I'm Dr. Cross. I just finished the tumor resection in 3. Your gurney's fine, someone's already on the way for it." Reeve did not apologize. Men like Reeve never apologize because an apology would require them to have seen you as a person capable of being wronged. He simply looked Elijah over a second time slower, letting his mistake curdle into contempt so that the error would be Elijah's fault and not his own, and said loud enough for the 2 residents behind him to hear. "Cross, right. The affirmative action higher. I keep forgetting they let you people hold the good instruments now." He smiled without warmth. "Do try not to break anything expensive." He walked away. The residents did not meet Elijah's eyes, and Elijah stood in the corridor with imaging in his hand that showed if anyone in that building had cared to look a surgical technique, he had invented himself, one that was about to make Gordon Reeve very famous and very rich, though Elijah did not know that yet. He also didn't know that a woman named Nora Ellison had been standing in the imaging doorway the whole time, holding a prototype she had built with her own hands, and that she had just watched the most important surgeon in her professional life get called transport staff by a man who did not deserve to sharpen his scalpels. To understand what Gordon Reeve took from Elijah Cross, you have to understand what Elijah had built, and to understand that you have to go back further than the hospital, to a town where the nearest neurosurgeon was 200 miles away, and a man had died in the back of his father's truck because they could not get him there in time. Elijah's father had been a long-haul mechanic, a man who could hear a failing engine 3 cars away and knew in his hands the exact tolerance of every part he ever touched. He had wanted his son to have a cleaner life than his own, a life indoors, a life the world respected, and he had pushed Elijah toward medicine the way a man pushes a boulder uphill with everything he had and no certainty it would move. But the thing that made Elijah a surgeon was not the pushing. It was the truck. It was the night when he was 14 and a neighbor collapsed with what they would later learn was a bleed on the brain, and there was no one within 200 miles who could open a skull, and the man died on the drive while Elijah's father drove 90 miles an hour down a dark highway, and Elijah held the man's head still in the back and understood in a way that never left him that geography and money and luck decided who lived, and that this was not a law of nature but a thing built by people, and that things built by people could be rebuilt. He got out, scholarships mostly, and the kind of relentlessness that his father had put in him with a wrench. He was the only one who looked like him in most of the rooms he studied in, and he learned early that his excellence would be treated as a surprise, and his mistakes as a confirmation that he would have to be twice as good to be considered half as safe, and he decided somewhere in his 20s that he would simply be 4 times as good and remove the argument entirely. He specialized in the surgeries. No one wanted the deep ones, the ones near the parts of the brain where a millimeter is the difference between a person and a vegetable, because those were the cases where skill could not be faked and connections could not save you, where the only thing in the room that mattered was whether your hands could do the impossible thing, and Elijah's hands could. And he had built something. Over 6 years in the margins of a punishing schedule, Elijah had developed a new surgical approach for a class of deep brain tumors that had been considered inoperable, a combination of a modified surgical corridor and a real-time mapping method that let a surgeon reach places that had been death sentences and come back out with the patient intact. It was in the small world of people who understood it, revolutionary. It could save thousands of the exact people who used to die in the backs of trucks. And it was unmistakably, entirely provably his. The problem was that Elijah could not do it alone. The mapping method needed hardware, a delicate real-time imaging integration that had to be built, and Elijah was a surgeon, not an engineer. Which is how Nora Ellison entered his life. Nora was a biomedical engineer, 31, brilliant in the specific, unshowy way of people who build things that have to work the first time or someone dies. She had grown up in the Midwest, the daughter of 2 school teachers, and she had the temperament of a person raised to believe that competence was a form of respect you paid to other people. She built surgical devices. She had read a paper Elijah published, a modest, careful paper that most people had skimmed and forgotten, and she had seen in it what almost no one else had, that the surgeon describing this approach was describing something that would work, and that all it needed was a machine that did not yet exist, and that she could build that machine. She had come to Elstrom Memorial to find him, not for romance, not for anything but the work. She had built a first prototype on her own dime, and she had come to show it to the one surgeon in the country she believed could use it, and she had arrived at the imaging suite 30 seconds before Gordon Reeve called that surgeon transport staff. She introduced herself to Elijah in the aftermath of that while he was still holding the imaging and the humiliation, and she did it in the way that would come to define her directly, without pity, treating him as the thing he was, rather than the thing Reeve had called him. Dr. Cross, my name is Nora Ellison. I'm an engineer. I read your corridor paper 18 months ago, and I've spent every weekend since building this. She held up the prototype, a compact, ugly, beautiful thing of wire and sensor and machined housing. It's the real-time integration you described in the discussion section. The part you said would require a device that didn't exist yet. It exists. I built it. It's crude, and it needs a surgeon who actually understands the approach to make it work. And as far as I can tell, there's exactly one of those in the country. And a man in a nice suit just called him transport staff, which tells me everyone here is even stupider than I feared. She held it out. I don't want anything from you except to build the thing you already designed. Will you look at it? Elijah looked at her and then at the prototype, and something happened in his chest that he had not let happen in a long time, which was hope. He took the device. He turned it over in his surgeon's hands, the way his father had turned over engine parts, feeling the tolerances. And he understood in about 90 seconds that this stranger had built the missing half of the most important thing he would ever do. Where did you learn to build this? He asked quietly. My father taught me that if a thing matters, you make it yourself and you make it right, Nora said. Yours mattered, so I made it. They began to work. It was not romance at first. It was better than romance in a way, or it was the only soil romance worth having ever grows in. It was 2 people who were each the best in the world, at their half of a single problem, discovering that the other half had a person attached to it. They worked in a borrowed lab in the hospital's research wing nights and weekends, Elijah bringing the surgical reality and Nora bringing the machine, refining the device through 100 iterations, testing it on models and then on cadaveric specimens, watching it get better and better, until the day came when both of them knew without saying it that it was ready to save an actual human being. They argued constantly and enjoyed every argument. She learned to read imaging almost as well as a resident. He learned enough engineering to be dangerous. They ate terrible food at 2 in the morning and laughed at things that were only funny to people who had been awake for 20 hours chasing the same dream. And slowly, so slowly that neither of them marked the day. It started, the work became the 2 of them, and the 2 of them became something that was going to outlast the work. Gordon Reeve found out about the device the way powerful men find out about everything, through the small betrayals of ambitious underlings. A resident mentioned it. Reeve, who as chief of neurosurgery had a claim on everything that happened in his department, asked to see it, and Elijah, who was naive in exactly one way. The way brilliant people are often naive, believed that the work would protect itself, that its obvious value would make theft impossible, that no one could take something so clearly his. He showed Reeve the device. He explained the approach. He was proud of it, and pride made him careless. And Gordon Reeve sat and listened and understood 2 things at once. The first was that this was the most important surgical advance he had encountered in 30 years. The second was that the man who had invented it was a black surgeon. Reeve had called transport staff in a hallway, a man with no institutional power, no wealthy backers, no name, outside the small circle of people who understood deep tumors, a man, in short, from whom something could be taken with very little risk. So Reeve took it. He did it the way these things are done, not with a theft you could point to, but with a slow, deniable annexation. He assigned himself as the supervising surgeon on the device's development, citing hospital policy that required a department chief to oversee any new surgical technology, which was real policy and also a leash. He had the intellectual property reviewed by the hospital's legal office and discovered, because Elijah had been too focused on the work to protect it, that under the terms of Elijah's employment, the hospital had a claim to inventions developed on its premises, and that as chief, Reeve controlled how that claim was administered. He began in meetings and grant applications and conversations with the hospital's board and its donors to describe the approach as a departmental initiative under his leadership, then as his vision, then by small increments, as his work with Elijah's role shrinking in each retelling from inventor to talented technician to finally a member of the team. And he moved to sideline Nora entirely because Nora was an outside engineer with a signed relationship to Elijah and not to the department, and Reeve had the power to declare her a liability, a non-employee with unauthorized access to a hospital project, and to have her barred from the building. It happened fast over about 2 months, and it happened as these things always do, faster than the people it was happening to could believe. Elijah went from being the inventor of a revolutionary technique to being a subordinate on a project Gordon Reeve was preparing to unveil to the world as his own crowning achievement. And when Elijah finally understood it, finally saw the whole shape of it, and went to the chief's office to confront him, Reeve did not even bother to deny it. "Let me explain how the world works, Dr. Cross, since no one seems to have done you the favor," Reeve said from behind a desk the size of a small boat. "Ideas are cheap. Every resident has ideas. What turns an idea into a surgical standard that saves lives is institutional weight, funding, a name the board trusts, donors who write checks because they recognize the surgeon's face from the magazine. You have none of those things, and you never will, because the world is not going to line up behind you, and pretending otherwise is a fantasy I don't have time for. I have those things. So this technique is going to change medicine, which is what you say you want. And it's going to do it with my name on it, because my name is the only vehicle capable of carrying it. You can be on the team quietly and have a career. Or you can make noise about who invented what, and I will bury you so completely that you will be lucky to find work reading scans in a strip mall. I've done it before. You're not the first talented man who thought talent was enough." He turned back to his monitor. "Send Ms. Ellison my regrets. Her access is revoked as of this morning. And do close the door." Elijah closed the door, not because he was beaten, though he felt beaten. He closed the door because he had learned from a father who could hear a failing engine 3 cars away that when a thing is broken, you do not scream at it, you diagnose it, and he needed to think, and he needed to find Nora, who had just been thrown out of the building where their life's work sat locked in a chief's ambition. He found her in the parking structure holding a cardboard box of her belongings, and she was not crying. She was furious, which was worse and better. "He can't do this," she said. "It's my hardware, Elijah. I built it in my own apartment before I ever set foot in this hospital. It's your approach. He didn't invent one screw of it." "He doesn't have to have invented it," Elijah said quietly. "He just has to control the story of it, and right now he does. He has the board, the donors, the legal office, the name. He has everything except the 2 things that don't matter to anyone until it's too late." He looked at the box in her arms. "The truth and the ability to actually do the surgery." "What does that mean? Actually do the surgery?" And Elijah, standing in a concrete parking structure with the ruins of 6 years in a cardboard box between them, began to understand the one thing Gordon Reeve had gotten fatally wrong. "It means," he said slowly, "that Reeve has never performed this operation. He can't. He doesn't understand the corridor, not really, not in his hands. He understands it the way a man understands a language he can read but not speak. He's going to take our technique to the world, Nora. He's going to schedule a case, a big one, a showcase, and he's going to stand in front of the cameras and the board and do the operation himself to prove it's his." Elijah's voice was very calm now, the calm of a man watching a diagnosis resolve into a plan. "And his hands can't do it. Ours can. That's the one thing he can't steal because it isn't a thing. It's 20 years of my father teaching me tolerances and 6 years of me learning where the millimeter is. Reeve can take the credit. He cannot take the corridor. And sooner or later, in front of everyone, he is going to have to try to walk down it, and he's going to get lost. The winter that followed was the hardest of Elijah's life, harder than the town, harder than the truck. Reeve was as good as his word. Elijah was not fired, that would have been too crude, but he was frozen, reassigned to routine cases cut out of the device's development, made to watch from the outside as Gordon Reeve prepared to unveil their work to the world. The hospital's public relations machine began to hum, positioning Reeve as a visionary on the cusp of a historic breakthrough. A date was set months out for a landmark surgery. A young woman named Priya with an inoperable deep tumor who had been told everywhere else that nothing could be done and who had come to Elstrom because of the whispers about a new approach. A surgery that Reeve intended to perform himself, live before an audience of the board, the press, and the medical world. The surgery that would make his name synonymous with the technique forever. And Reeve did the thing that men like Reeve always do to the people they have wronged, which is to try to make them complicit. He needed Elijah in the end, though. He would never admit it, because the case was real, and the patient was real, and Reeve was not actually confident in the deepest chamber of himself that he could do it. So he offered Elijah a role. Second surgeon. In the room at the table, close enough to save it, if Reeve got into trouble, but silent, credited nowhere. A safety net that would let Reeve take the glory while Elijah took the risk. It was a monstrous offer, and it was designed to be one because Reeve wanted Elijah to either refuse and thereby abandon a patient who would probably die, or accept and thereby become an accessory to his own erasure. Either way, Reeve won. Elijah almost refused. Nora, who by then was more than his partner in the work, wanted him to refuse, wanted him to walk out and take the whole thing public and let Reeve fail on his own. But Elijah could not stop thinking about Priya, 26 years old, who had come to Elstrom because it was the only place left that offered her a chance, and who did not know and would never care whose name was on the technique that might save her, only whether the hands in her skull knew where the millimeter was. And he thought about a man dying in the back of a truck 200 miles from help, and he understood that he had not built any of this to win an argument with Gordon Reeve. He had built it so that people like Priya would not die. "I'm going to be in that room," he told Nora. "Not for Reeve, for her. I won't let him kill that girl to protect his story, but I need you to understand what I'm choosing, because it's going to look from the outside like I let him win." Nora looked at him for a long moment in the borrowed corner of a coffee shop that had become their new office now that the hospital was closed to them, and she did the thing that told Elijah more than any word what she had become to him. She did not argue. She understood. "Then we do it right," she said. "If you're going to be in that room to save her, we make sure that room is the room where the truth comes out too. Because I'm done watching that man take what's ours. Elijah, I'll be in that room too. He revoked my access to the hospital. He did not revoke my access to the truth. And I have spent a winter documenting exactly who built what every version of that device, every design file with my name and the date on it, every note in your handwriting from 6 years before Gordon Reeve ever heard the word corridor." She almost smiled, and there was steel in it. "He built his whole theft on the assumption that we couldn't prove it. Let's prove it. In front of the board. On the day he needs the most." They fell fully in love that winter, in the strange way that people fall in love inside a shared war, when every ordinary tenderness is sharpened by the thing you are fighting together. It was not a winter of romance in any soft sense. It was a winter of documents and design files and long nights building the case of Nora, teaching Elijah exactly what the paper trail proved, and Elijah teaching Nora exactly what would happen minute by minute in the operating room, so that she would know precisely when the truth could be told. But it was also a winter of the small things that are the actual substance of love, the way she fell asleep against his shoulder over a laptop at 4 a.m, the way he learned she took her coffee. The argument about a design tolerance that turned without either of them steering it into the first time they kissed in a coffee shop after closing, surrounded by the evidence of everything that had been stolen from them, and everything they were about to take back. Neither of them said the word for it. They didn't need to. It was in the fact that when Elijah imagined the moment in the operating room when everything would be at stake, the person he imagined at his side always was her. Reeve did not wait quietly for the surgery, though. Men like Reeve never leave an enemy standing when they can arrange for him to fall. And somewhere in that winter, he understood that the safest thing was not merely to sideline Elijah, but to destroy his credibility entirely before the landmark case, so that if Elijah ever spoke, he would speak as a discredited man. So, Reeve reached for the oldest weapon in a hospital, the one that can end a surgeon without ever proving anything a complaint. A patient of Elijah's from months before a routine case with an ordinary and well-documented complication was quietly re-examined by a review committee. Reeve populated with his allies and reframed in the careful language of institutional suspicion as a possible error, a lapse, a question of judgment. It was nothing. Elijah knew it was nothing. But a nothing whispered by a chief into the right committee could become a suspension, and a suspension could become the end of a career. And Reeve knew that a black surgeon accused of a lapse would be believed guilty by a system already primed to expect it in exactly the way that Reeve himself, accused of anything, would be given the benefit of every doubt. It was a young resident who saved that at a cost to herself that Elijah never forgot. Her name was Dr. Aisha Farrell, and she had scrubbed in on the case in question, and she knew because she had been there that there had been no error, that the complication had been anticipated, disclosed, and managed exactly by the book. When the review committee began its quiet work, Aisha understood immediately what it was, a chief building a weapon, and she understood that the safe thing, the career-preserving thing, was to say nothing, because residents who cross chiefs do not become attending surgeons. She didn't do the safe thing. She went to the committee, and then when the committee proved to be Reeve's committee, she went over its head to the hospital's separate patient safety office with the complete operative record and her own signed account, and she made it impossible for the nothing to become a something without exposing the people trying to build it. It cost her. Reeve saw to it that her fellowship applications met unexplained resistance for a year until the whole edifice came down and took his influence with it. But she had bought Elijah the one thing he needed, his standing intact, so that on the day he stepped forward in that operating theater, he stepped forward as a surgeon in good standing and not as a man under a cloud. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a rescue that vindicated him and a rescue that could have been spun as the desperate act of a man already suspected. Elijah would repay Aisha too, later the way he repaid everyone who had stood in front of a knife for him, by building a program where a resident who told the truth about a chief was rewarded instead of ruined, and by making sure Aisha Farrell trained on the corridor technique under the one surgeon in the country who could teach it, and became in time one of the few people alive who could do what Elijah could do. Priya, meanwhile, waited through that winter with the strange patience of the very ill, and Elijah came to know her against every rule of the situation because he could not help it. She was 26, a music teacher, and she had been told in 4 cities that her tumor was inoperable and that she should get her affairs in order, and she had refused to accept it with a stubbornness that reminded Elijah of his father, and she had found her way to Elstrom on the rumor of a new approach. She did not know the politics. She did not know that the technique that might save her was the subject of a war between the chief who claimed it and the surgeon who had built it. She knew only that a doctor named Cross had sat with her longer than any of the others had explained exactly what was in her head, and exactly what he would try to do about it in plain words without the false comfort or the false doom. And that when she asked him whether she would live, he had told her the truth, which was that he didn't know, but that if anyone on earth could do it, it would be done by the hands that had built the way in. She had chosen to trust those hands. She did not care whose name went on the technique. And it was Priya, more than the theft, more than Reeve, more than the injustice of it, who had made Elijah decide to stand in that operating room no matter the cost, because he had built the entire thing for exactly her, and he was not going to let a man's vanity kill her to protect a story. The day came. The operating theater at Elstrom Memorial had an observation gallery, and on the day of Priya's surgery the gallery was full. The board, the donors, the press pool, the hospital had carefully invited the medical dignitaries who had come to witness Gordon Reeve make history. Reeve had staged it like a coronation. He addressed the gallery before scrubbing in, describing his years of vision, his breakthrough, his technique, and the cameras drank it in, and Elijah stood silent in his own scrubs at the second surgeon's position, and Nora sat in the gallery among the board members with a folder in her lap and her heart going like a hammer. Then the surgery began, and everything Elijah had predicted came true, in order exactly as a diagnosis comes true. Reeve opened well enough the parts that were ordinary neurosurgery, the parts any chief could do. And then he reached the corridor, the deep approach that was the whole invention, the part that was Elijah's 20 years and 6 years in his father's hands. And Gordon Reeve got lost. It It was visible on the monitors that fed the gallery, though only the surgeons in the room understood at first what they were seeing. The small hesitations, the wrong angle of approach, the mounting tension in a man who had read the language but could not speak it, who was now trying to speak it, live in a real skull with a real young woman's life and his entire reputation on the table, and who was failing. The device, Nora's device, was telling him where the danger was, mapping the millimeter in real time, and Reeve could see the map and could not follow it because following it required a thing the map could not give him, and that thing was in the hands of the man he had called transport staff. Priya began to destabilize. A vessel Reeve should not have been near started to bleed. The anesthesiologist's numbers began to move in the direction numbers move before a person dies. And Gordon Reeve, in front of the board and the donors and the cameras and the medical world, froze because he had reached the exact place where credit runs out and only the corridor remains, and he did not know the way. And a young woman was bleeding into her own brain because of it. And Elijah Cross stepped forward and took over the operation. He did not ask permission. There was no time and there was no permission that mattered more than Priya's life. He moved into the primary position and his hands found the corridor, the way his father's hands had found a failing part in the dark, and he did the thing he had invented. The thing that was his, calmly. Precisely walking the millimeter, controlling the bleed, correcting Reeve's wrong angle, reaching the tumor that had been called inoperable everywhere on Earth and removing it, all of it, and bringing Priya back out intact, her speech intact, her self intact, her life intact in front of an audience that had come to watch Gordon Reeve and was now watching in a silence that spread through the gallery like cold water, exactly who could actually do the operation and who could not. The medical people in the gallery understood first because they knew what they were seeing, that the chief had failed and the second surgeon had saved it, and that the second surgeon had not simply rescued a case. He had performed the technique with a mastery that made it obvious, undeniable to anyone who understood surgery, that this was his native language, and Reeve had only been miming it. The whispers started in the gallery, the same low, collective sound that ends men, and the board members turned to each other, and the cameras kept rolling, and Gordon Reeve stood at the second surgeon's position now where Elijah had left him, a chief demoted to bystander in his own coronation. Watching a man he had tried to erase save the life in the surgery, and though Reeve did not yet fully grasp it, take back the truth in front of everyone whose belief he had stolen it with, Priya lived. That was the first thing, the thing that mattered most to Elijah, that the young woman came off the table whole. But the reckoning came too, and Nora had made sure the ground was prepared for it. When the surgery was over and the gallery was still stunned, and Reeve was already reaching for a version of the story that would make the rescue his plan all along. Nora Ellison stood up in the gallery among the board members and asked to be heard, and because she was holding a folder and speaking with the calm of someone who has proof, they let her. She laid it out plainly the way she did everything. She told them who had invented the approach with the dated papers to show it. She told them who had built the device with the design files and the timestamps that predated Reeve's involvement by years. She told them the sequence of the annexation, the self-appointment as supervising surgeon, the shrinking of Elijah's role in each retelling, the revocation of her own access, the offer of the silent second surgeon position designed to make Elijah either abandon a patient or bury himself. And she told them the thing they had all just watched with their own eyes, that Gordon Reeve could not perform the technique he had claimed as his own, and that everyone in that gallery who understood surgery had just seen the actual inventor demonstrate the difference between reading a language and speaking it. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The board had come to witness a breakthrough, and they had only. The breakthrough was the opposite of the one they had been promised, and it could not be unwitnessed because the cameras Reeve had invited to glorify himself had recorded every second of it. It did not all collapse in a day. It never does. But it collapsed. The medical press, which Reeve had invited to crown him, ran the story that actually happened because it was a far better story, and because a room full of witnesses made it impossible to spin. And the story was the chief of neurosurgery froze in a landmark operation, and the surgeon he had sidelined stepped in and saved the patient using a technique the surgeon himself had invented and the chief had claimed. The intellectual property question, once it was examined by people outside Reeve's control, resolved clearly because the paper trail Nora had built was airtight and the dates did not lie. The hospital's board, which cared about many things but cared above all about not being the institution that had tried to steal a life-saving advance from the man who created it and nearly killed a patient doing it, moved with the speed of people protecting themselves. Gordon Reeve was removed as chief. The review of his conduct led to a review of other conduct, because men who steal once have usually stolen before, and the more people looked, the more they found residents whose research had vanished into the chief's name. Colleagues who had been buried for crossing him. A whole quiet history of a man who had built a great reputation on other people's work, and the fear of what he would do to anyone who said so. He was not imprisoned. The theft of credit is rarely a crime you can jail a man for. But he lost the thing he had spent his life accumulating and defending, which was his name, and for a man like Reeve, that was the only prison that could hold him. His hospital privileges were suspended, pending the conduct review, and then quietly not restored. The professional societies that had feted him found reasons to distance themselves. The donors whose checks had followed his face followed it right out the door. And in the cruelest and most fitting turn of all, the technique that he had tried to make synonymous with his name became synonymous permanently with the opposite, with the story of the man who could not perform his own claimed invention, and the man who could, so that for the rest of Gordon Reeve's life, every time the corridor approach was mentioned, and it would be mentioned for decades because it did exactly what Elijah had built it to do, and saved thousands of the people who used to die. In the backs of trucks, it would carry attached to it forever the name Cross and not the name Reeve, and Reeve would have to hear it and know. Elijah did not stay at Elstrom. He did not need to and did not want to. The surgery that had been meant to make Reeve famous made Elijah something better than famous. It made him undeniable, and offers came from everywhere, real ones, now from institutions that understood exactly what they were getting. He took the one that let him build what he had wanted to build since he was 14 years old, holding a dying man's head in the back of a truck. He founded a surgical program specifically designed to bring the corridor technique and the surgeons who could perform it to the places that had none, the 200 miles from help places, the towns and the county hospitals, and the parts of the world where geography still decided who lived, because Elijah had never forgotten that the whole point was never the technique. It was the truck. It was the man who died because of where he happened to be, and Elijah meant to spend the rest of his life making sure that fewer and fewer people died for that reason. He built it with Nora. Of course, he built it with Nora. She ran the engineering, the manufacturing of the devices, the training of the technicians, the whole machine that turned one surgeon's hands into a thing that could be given to the world, and she did it, as his equal, in every way. Named on everything, credited on everything, because Elijah had learned in the hardest way what it cost to let your work walk into a building without your name protecting it, and he would sooner have cut off his own hands than let happen to Nora what Reeve had tried to do to them both. They married in the second spring in the town. Elijah had come from the town 200 miles from the nearest neurosurgeon because Elijah had wanted his father to stand up at the wedding in the place where he had once driven 90 miles an hour down a dark highway with his son holding a dying man in the back, and where because of the program his son had built there was now a surgeon within reach, and no one would ever have to make that drive again. His father gave a short speech. He was not a man of many words, a mechanic who could hear a failing engine 3 cars away, and he said only that he had spent his whole life fixing things other people gave up on, and that he had raised a son who fixed the one thing he never could, which was the distance between a sick man and the help he needed, and that he was the proudest father in any state you cared to name. And then he looked at Nora and said that any woman who could build a machine to reach into a person's brain and had chosen his son to reach with it was welcome in his family for as long as she wanted, which he hoped was forever. Aisha Farrell came to the wedding too, an attending surgeon now in her own right, and she and Priya the resident who had told the truth and the patient whose life it had helped save got for the first time on the dance floor, and became that night the kind of friends who are welded together by having been on the same side of the same fire without ever having known it at the time. Elijah watched them from across the room and thought that this, more than any technique, more than any reckoning, was the actual shape of a life worth building, a room full of people who had chosen the truth when the safe thing was to stay quiet, all of them finally on the far side of the winter and still standing. Priya came to the wedding. She was entirely well back at the life the whole world had told her was over, and she danced and she found Elijah late in the evening and did not know how to thank him. And he told her the truth, which was that she did not owe him anything, that he had built the whole thing for her before he ever met her, for the version of her who used to die in the backs of trucks, and that her being alive and dancing was not a debt. It was the entire point, the thing the work was for. And Nora stood beside him while he said it is equal. His partner, the engineer who had built the missing half of his life's work, and then turned out to be the missing half of his life. And Elijah thought about a chief behind a desk the size of a boat, telling him that the world was never going to line up behind him, and that talent was not enough. Reeve had been right that talent was not enough. That was the one true thing the man had ever said. Talent was not enough. You needed the truth, and you needed someone who would stand up in a full gallery and prove it, and you needed hands that could walk the millimeter when a man's life ran out of credit, and you needed a reason bigger than winning, and you needed most of all the one person in a building full of people who called you transport staff, who had looked at you and seen instead the only surgeon in the country who could do the impossible thing. Talent was not enough, but talent and the truth, and Nora Ellison, had turned out to be more than enough to bury Gordon Reeve and to save Priya, and to make sure that somewhere tonight in a town 200 miles from anywhere, a man with a bleed on his brain would live, because a boy who once held a dying stranger's head in the back of a truck had refused all the way down to accept that the distance could not be closed.